It was a seemingly ordinary evening in the heart of the city. Jamal, a well-dressed man in his mid-30s, walked into a well-lit pharmacy, prescription in hand. He just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to picking up his medication and heading home. But what started as a routine errand would soon unravel into an encounter he'd never forget. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the weight of the pharmacist's gaze. Harold, the store manager, stood behind the counter, his posture stiff, his eyes sharp and unwelcoming. Jamal couldn't understand why, but something about the man's demeanor made his steps falter. As Jamal approached the counter, he offered a polite nod and placed his prescription on the desk. "Good evening," he said with a calm, friendly tone. Harold, however, didn't respond in kind. Instead, he picked up the slip of paper and scrutinized it as though it were a counterfeit bill. His brows furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. The air grew heavy, and Jamal could feel the tension building. "This doesn't look right," Harold muttered, his voice tinged with suspicion. Jamal blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry, that's a valid prescription. My doctor just wrote it this morning," he explained, keeping his tone even. But Harold didn't seem convinced. He looked up, his eyes meeting Jamal's with a mixture of doubt and hostility. "I'll need to verify this," Harold said curtly before disappearing into the back room. Jamal stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The seconds dragged on, stretching into minutes. Other customers came and went, some glancing at him with curiosity, others with indifference. Still, Harold didn't return. When the store manager finally reappeared, his expression was unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said, though there was no sincerity in his voice. "I can't fill this prescription. It looks fraudulent." Jamal felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he was too stunned to respond. Then, finding his voice, he said, "Fraudulent? That's impossible. You can call my doctor and confirm it yourself." Harold shook his head, his lips twisting into a faint smirk. "I don't need to do that. I've been in this business for years, and I know a fake when I see one. Now, if you don't mind, I have other customers to attend to." Jamal's shock quickly gave way to anger. "You're making a mistake," he said firmly, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby shoppers. "This prescription is legitimate, and you have no right to deny me service." Harold's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "If you don't leave now, I'll have to call security," he warned. Jamal stared at him, his heart pounding. He felt humiliated, but he wasn't about to back down. "Go ahead," he challenged, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. Harold's hand hovered over the phone, but he hesitated, perhaps sensing that Jamal wouldn't be so easily intimidated. In the end, it wasn't security that escorted Jamal out of the pharmacy, it was Harold himself. The manager's hand hovered near Jamal's elbow, as if to guide him out, but Jamal shrugged him off. He walked out onto the busy street, prescription still in hand, his chest tight with frustration and humiliation. The bright city lights seemed to mock him, their glow a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. For a moment, he stood there, trying to collect his thoughts. Then, taking a deep breath, he resolved to take action. Jamal's first stop was the local police station. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he'd receive, but he was determined to prove his innocence. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he explained his situation to the officer on duty. The officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, listened intently. "Do you have any identification?" she asked. Jamal nodded, pulling out his wallet. The officer took his ID and the prescription, examining them carefully. Then, she made a phone call to the doctor's office listed on the slip. Within minutes, the truth was confirmed. The prescription was genuine. Armed with this validation, Jamal returned to the pharmacy, this time accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Harold's face turned pale when he saw them enter. "What's going on here?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier bravado. The officers explained the situation, their tone professional but firm. "We've confirmed that this prescription is legitimate," one of them said. "You need to fill it." Harold hesitated, his eyes darting between Jamal and the officers. Then, with a reluctant nod, he took the prescription and disappeared into the back. The transaction was completed in silence, but the damage had already been done. As Jamal walked out of the pharmacy, the bag containing his medication felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just about the prescription anymore, it was about the principle. Harold's actions had been a blatant act of discrimination, and Jamal knew he couldn't let it go unchecked. That night, he sat down at his computer and typed out his story. He shared every detail, the looks, the words, the humiliation. Then, with a deep breath, he hit send. The next morning, his phone buzzed incessantly. Messages and notifications flooded in as his story gained traction online. People were outraged, their comments echoing the anger and frustration Jamal felt. Among the messages was one from a local news station. They wanted to interview him. Jamal hesitated for a moment, then agreed. If sharing his experience could spark a conversation about discrimination, it was worth it. The interview took place later that day. The reporter, Linda Price, was a seasoned journalist with a reputation for tackling tough issues. She listened intently as Jamal recounted his ordeal, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to outrage. "And how did that make you feel?" she asked gently. Jamal hesitated, his voice heavy with emotion. "It made me feel like I didn't matter, like my word and dignity didn't mean anything. This isn't just about me, it's about how people in power use their authority to discriminate." The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Social media exploded with comments, shares, and calls for action. People demanded accountability, not just from Harold but from the pharmacy chain as a whole. By the end of the week, the company released a public statement, apologizing for the incident and promising to investigate. Harold was placed on leave pending the outcome, but for Jamal, it wasn't about punishment, it was about change. He wanted people to see the broader issue, the systemic bias that allowed incidents like this to happen. He began speaking at community events, sharing his story and encouraging others to speak up. Slowly but surely, his voice became part of a larger movement, one that demanded equality and justice. Months later, Jamal received a letter from the pharmacy chain. They thanked him for bringing the issue to their attention and outlined the steps they were taking to address it. Mandatory training, stricter oversight, and a commitment to diversity were just the beginning. Jamal read the letter twice, a small smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As he folded the letter and placed it on his desk, Jamal felt a sense of closure. The experience had been painful, but it had also been transformative. He learned that change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And sometimes, it started with one voice refusing to be silenced. Jamal looked out the window at the bustling city below, a sense of hope blooming in his chest.